Have you ever felt judged by your appearance? Told you don't belong somewhere you have every right to be? What you're about to hear is the story of a man who faced that very humiliation at an airport gate in front of dozens of strangers. A decorated pilot, Captain Marcus Thorne of Prestige Air, took one look at a passenger in worn-out clothes and decided he was a threat that he was too poor to fly. But the captain's snap judgment, his arrogant abuse of power, was the single biggest mistake of his life. He wasn't just barring a passenger. He was grounding his own career and threatening to bring down an entire airline because the man he publicly shamed wasn't just any traveler. He was the one man who held their fate in his hands. This is the story of how a quiet act of prejudice triggered a catastrophic reckoning. The air in Terminal 3 of Chicago O'Hare International was a familiar symphony of chaos. The rhythmic clatter of rolling suitcases, the cacophony of final boarding calls for flights to Dallas and Denver, the distant muffled roar of jet engines spooling up on the tarmac. It was the lifeblood of a world in constant motion. Dr. Alistair Finch sat on one of the cold, hard plastic chairs near Gate K-12, a small island of stillness in the rushing river of humanity. He was a man designed to be overlooked, especially today. His attire was a carefully chosen uniform of invisibility, a faded gray hoodie with the logo of a long-forgotten tech startup, a pair of Levi's jeans worn soft and frayed at the cuffs, and a pair of scuffed, dusty work boots that had seen better decades. A simple black backpack containing little more than a paperback novel and a water bottle rested at his feet. He looked to the casual observer like a man adrift, perhaps a construction worker heading home after a long job or a student on a budget. This was precisely the intention. Alistair was in fact a man of immense and quiet power, though his demeanor betrayed none of it. At 48, his face was a roadmap of thoughtful experience with deep-set, observant eyes that missed nothing. He was a senior field investigator for the Federal Aviation Administration, a ghost in the machine of civil aviation. His job was to exist in the margins, to see airlines not as they presented themselves in glossy commercials, but as they truly were on the ground, in the trenches of daily operations. Today, Prestige Air was under his microscope. The airline was nearing the end of its probationary period for a renewed 5-year operating license, and Alistair was conducting the final unannounced Customer Experience and Compliance Audit. It was the most crucial test, the one they couldn't prepare for. He watched the gate agents, a team of 2 women preparing for the boarding of Flight 722 to Washington, D.C. The senior agent, a woman with a severe blonde bob and a name tag that read Brenda, moved with a practiced, almost brittle efficiency. She barked instructions at her younger colleague and tapped impatiently on her keyboard, her face set in a permanent mask of strained tolerance. Brenda looked like a woman who had long ago traded any semblance of customer service for the grim satisfaction of enforcing rules. Alistair's ticket was booked in coach seat 34B, a middle seat, naturally. The name on the ticket was simply A. Finch, anonymous enough to avoid flagging any internal systems. He had checked in online, but had intentionally requested a physical boarding pass at the counter, a small test of the staff's patience. The counter agent had been curt but professional. Here at the gate, however, the atmosphere felt different. It was charged with a sense of self-importance that seemed to emanate from the crew themselves. The flight crew arrived, striding through the waiting passengers like celebrities on a red carpet. The flight attendants were immaculate, their smiles bright but impersonal. Leading them was the pilot, a man who radiated an aura of supreme confidence that bordered on arrogance. He was tall and silver-haired with a chiseled jaw and the kind of deep tan that spoke of leisure time spent in sunny locales. His uniform was perfectly tailored, his gold epaulets gleaming under the terminal lights. His name tag read Captain Marcus Thorne. As Thorne passed, his gaze swept over the waiting area, a king surveying his subjects. His eyes briefly landed on Alistair, and in that fleeting moment Alistair saw it all, a flicker of disdain, a subtle curl of the lip, a micro-expression of judgment that was as clear as a spoken insult. Thorne saw the faded hoodie, the scuffed boots, and dismissed the man wearing them. He said nothing, of course, merely adjusted his tie and proceeded down the jet bridge with his entourage, but the message had been sent. Alistair felt a familiar cold knot tighten in his stomach. He had seen that look countless times in his life in various contexts. It was a look that judged the book by its tattered cover and summarily condemned it. He calmly opened his paperback, a collection of essays on civil engineering, but he wasn't reading. He was observing. He noted how Brenda spoke to the other passengers. An elderly couple who had a question about their seat assignments were treated with thinly veiled impatience. A young family struggling with a stroller and 2 crying children were offered no assistance, only a stern reminder to have their documents ready. This wasn't just a single employee having a bad day. This felt cultural. It was a top-down rot, and Alistair had a strong suspicion that Captain Thorne was the source of the decay. We will now begin boarding Prestige Air Flight 722 to Washington, Ronald Reagan Airport. Brenda's voice crackled over the PA system, sharp and devoid of warmth. We invite our first-class passengers, our Platinum Elite members, and any active-duty military personnel to begin boarding at this time. Alistair watched as the privileged few made their way to the front. He waited patiently for his zone to be called. He was in Zone 4, the last group to board. It was all part of the test. He wanted to see how the dregs, the economy-class masses, were treated. When his zone was finally called, he slung his backpack over his shoulder and joined the queue. As he neared the podium, he saw Captain Thorne reappear at the end of the jet bridge, leaning against the doorway and chatting with Brenda. He wasn't in the cockpit preparing for departure. He was lingering, observing the final passengers board his aircraft. It was unusual, a deviation from standard procedure. Most captains were focused on pre-flight checklists by this stage. Thorne seemed to be performing a second unofficial screening. When Alistair reached the front, he handed his boarding pass and ID to Brenda. She scanned the pass, and the machine beeped affirmatively. But she didn't hand it back. Her eyes darted from the pass to Alistair's face, then to his clothes, and finally nervously towards her captain. Thorne pushed himself off the wall and walked slowly towards the podium, his polished black shoes clicking on the linoleum floor. He stopped beside Brenda, crossing his arms, and looking Alistair up and down with an expression of open contempt. "Is there a problem with this passenger, Brenda?" Thorne asked, his voice a low, authoritative rumble. He didn't look at Brenda when he spoke. His eyes were locked on Alistair. Brenda swallowed, clearly intimidated, but also eager to please her superior. I'm not sure, Captain. Something just feels off." Alistair remained perfectly still, his expression neutral. Inside his mind was a whirring engine of data collection. He noted the time. He noted Brenda's exact words. He noted the other passengers in line turning to stare, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding drama. "Off," Thorne repeated, a smirk playing on his lips. He took a step closer to Alistair, invading his personal space. The scent of expensive cologne wafted from him. "Let me see his ticket." Brenda handed the boarding pass to the captain. Thorne held it with 2 fingers, as if it were a dirty object. He glanced at the name A. Finch, then let his gaze travel slowly over Alistair once more, from the scuffed boots to the frayed hoodie. "Mr. Finch," Thorne said, drawing out the name mockingly. "You're flying to D.C. today. Big business in the capital." "I have a meeting," Alistair replied, his voice even and calm. He refused to be baited, refused to show any anger or fear. He was a gray rock, and Thorne's arrogance would break against him. "A meeting," Thorne chuckled, a sound devoid of any humor. "Right. Look, I've been flying for 25 years. I have a sixth sense for trouble, and you, sir, are setting off all my alarms." This was it, the critical moment. Alistair knew exactly what regulations were in play. A pilot had ultimate authority over their aircraft, but that authority was not absolute. It could not be exercised in a discriminatory or capricious manner. Pilot's discretion was a shield, not a sword. "I can assure you, Captain," Alistair said, his voice dropping slightly, carrying a new weight of seriousness. "I am not trouble. I am a ticketed passenger, and I intend to board this flight." The line behind him was growing restless. A man in a business suit muttered, "What's the holdup? Let's go." Thorne ignored him. He was locked in a battle of wills with the man in the hoodie. To him, this was about asserting his dominance, about cleansing his pristine aircraft of an undesirable element. "That's not going to happen," Thorne declared, his voice rising now, playing to the audience of passengers and his crew. "I am the captain of this aircraft, and I am responsible for the safety and comfort of everyone on board. Your appearance is not conducive to a comfortable environment. Frankly, you look like you were pulled out of a gutter. We have standards on prestige air." The words hung in the air, sharp and ugly. "Looks poor." The unspoken accusation was now spoken. The prejudice was laid bare for all to see. Brenda winced. The younger gate agent looked at the floor, mortified. Even some of the waiting passengers shifted uncomfortably. Alistair felt a surge of cold anger, but he mastered it instantly. His face remained an unreadable mask. This was more than he could have ever hoped for. Thorne wasn't just being unprofessional. He was building the FAA's case for them, brick by damning brick. "So to be clear, Captain Thorne," Alistair said, his voice precise and clear, "you are denying me a fare-paying passenger boarding based on my appearance. I'm denying you boarding because my gut tells me you're a security risk." Thorne snapped back, but his justification was transparently false. He had said nothing of security until now. His initial complaint was about comfort and standards. "And I don't like your attitude. This conversation is over. Brenda, mark him as denied boarding, security discretion." He tossed the boarding pass onto the podium, a gesture of finality. He turned his back on Alistair and addressed the gawking passengers in line. "Apologies for the delay, folks. Just ensuring a safe and pleasant flight for all of you. We'll get you on board now." He strode back down the jet bridge, disappearing from view. The king returning to his castle. Brenda, looking pale and shaken but still following orders, began typing furiously into her computer. Alistair stood his ground for a moment longer. He looked at Brenda's trembling fingers on the keyboard. He looked at the faces of the other passengers, a mixture of pity, annoyance, and veiled agreement. He had been publicly shamed, dismissed as human refuse by a man in a position of power. He was an auditor who had set out to test the system and had found it to be more rotten than he could have imagined. He took a slow, deep breath, stepped aside from the line, and pulled out his phone. He did not call customer service. He did not call a lawyer. He scrolled to a secure number deep in his contacts, a direct line to the heart of federal aviation oversight. The storm had passed over him. Now the hurricane was about to be unleashed. The passengers shuffled past Alistair, a river diverting around a stone. Some shot him furtive, sympathetic glances. Others, like the businessmen who had been complaining about the delay, looked at him with a renewed suspicion, now convinced the captain's judgment must have been sound. To them, Alistair was no longer just a man in shabby clothes. He was a problem that had been solved, a minor disruption, now relegated to the periphery. They found their seats, stowed their bags, and settled in the incident already fading into the mundane rhythm of air travel. Alistair found a deserted gate area a few dozen yards away and sat down. The humiliation stung a dull, persistent ache beneath his professional calm. It was one thing to theorize about systemic prejudice, and another to have it aimed at you so publicly, so dismissively. But overriding the personal sting was a cold, clear sense of purpose. Captain Thorne and Brenda, in their arrogance, had handed him a perfect case study, a textbook example of regulatory failure. This was no longer a routine audit. This was now a major incident. He dialed the number. It was answered on the first ring, a crisp, professional voice cutting through the airport noise. "Sharma." "Anya, it's Alistair," he said, keeping his voice low. Anya Sharma was the director of the FAA's Office of Audit and Evaluation, Alistair's boss, and one of the most formidable figures in Washington's regulatory circles. "Alistair, I trust your flight to DC is on schedule," she asked. A humorless smile touched Alistair's lips. "There's been a slight change of plans. I won't be on it. I've just been denied boarding." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Anya Sharma was not a woman given to pauses. "Denied boarding," she repeated, her voice sharpening with focus. "On what grounds? The official reason hastily concocted was security risk based on pilot's discretion. And the actual reason, stated quite clearly by the captain in front of numerous witnesses, was, and I quote, that my appearance is not conducive to a comfortable environment, and that I look like I was pulled out of a gutter." Another pause, this one longer, more dangerous. Alistair could practically hear the gears turning in her mind, the implications branching out, the potential consequences escalating. "The captain's name," she said. It wasn't a question. "Captain Marcus Thorne. The gate agent who complied was named Brenda. Airline is Prestige Air Flight 722 ORD to DCA. They are currently completing boarding." "They are not," Anya stated with absolute finality. "That aircraft is not going anywhere. Stay where you are, Alistair. Document everything you can remember. Names, times, exact quotes, the reactions of other passengers. I am issuing a ground stop order for Flight 722, effective immediately pending an on-site federal investigation. I'm also contacting O'Hare's FAA liaison and the head of security for Prestige Air. A hornet's nest is about to be kicked. Try not to get stung." "Understood," Alistair said. The line went dead. He leaned his head back against the cool glass of the terminal window, watching Flight 722 through the pane. The jet bridge was still connected. The ground crew was milling about, but the final preparations had stalled. He saw the cargo doors, which had been in the process of closing, halt and remain open. The pushback tug, which had been approaching the nose gear, stopped, and then slowly reversed. Everything had frozen. Inside the Boeing 737, Captain Marcus Thorne sat in the cockpit, radiating satisfaction. He'd just finished the pre-flight checklist with his first officer, a younger man named David, who had been silent during the gate incident. "That's how you handle riffraff, David," Thorne said, clapping the first officer on the shoulder. "You can't let this job become a glorified bus service. We are professionals entrusted with a multi-million-dollar asset and the lives of decent people. We have to maintain standards." "He did have a valid ticket, Captain," David offered tentatively. "The ticket gets you to the gate. I decide who gets on the plane." Thorne retorted his tone, leaving no room for argument. He keyed his microphone to speak to the cabin. "Folks, this is your captain speaking. We're just waiting on the final paperwork from the ground crew. Should be pushing back from the gate in just a couple of minutes. Flight time to Washington is looking smooth, about an hour and 45 minutes once we're airborne." As he finished his announcement, a frantic voice crackled in his headset. It was the Prestige Air Station manager, a man named Robert Paulson. "Marcus, what in God's name did you do at the gate?" Paulson's voice was tight with panic. Thorne was taken aback by the tone. "I did my job, Robert. I removed a potential security threat, a transient-looking character causing a disturbance. It was a standard exercise of captain's discretion. The paperwork is on its way." "Forget the paperwork," Paulson hissed. "I just got a call from corporate. They got a call from the FAA, a top-level call. Flight 722 is under an immediate and indefinite ground stop order. Federal mandate. They want the entire crew to deplane and report to my office. Now. And Marcus, they specifically asked for you." The blood drained from Thorne's face. FAA, a top-level call. Ground stop. These were not words a pilot ever wanted to hear, especially not in connection with their own flight. This went far beyond a disgruntled passenger filing a complaint. This was an institutional response, swift and severe. What was the passenger's name?" Thorne asked, a knot of dread tightening in his chest. "I don't know, Marcus. All they said was that a federal field investigator was on your flight manifest, and you just denied him boarding. They said you threw a lit match into a tanker full of jet fuel." The cockpit suddenly felt very small, the air thick and unbreathable. An FAA investigator. Not some low-level inspector, but a field investigator. The kind of person who could recommend the revocation of licenses, the grounding of entire fleets. The man in the hoodie. The man he had called gutter trash. Thorne's arrogance for the first time in years was replaced by a wave of cold, terrifying fear. Back in the terminal, the passengers on Flight 722 were growing restless. The flight attendants, including the young and conscientious Isabella Rossi, who had witnessed the incident with dismay, had no information to give. Then the jet bridge door opened, and a flustered-looking Robert Paulson, the station manager, stepped aboard. He walked directly to the cockpit. A few moments later, Captain Thorne and his first officer emerged, their faces pale and grim. They walked down the aisle without making eye contact with anyone, and disappeared up the jet bridge. This was unprecedented. The passengers began to murmur, a wave of confusion and anxiety spreading through the cabin. Then Paulson's voice, strained and nervous, came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. Due to unforeseen operational circumstances, this flight has been temporarily grounded. We ask that you please collect your belongings and deplane back into the terminal. Our gate agents will have further information for you. We sincerely apologize for the inconvenience." A groan of collective frustration filled the aircraft. The carefully ordered world of Flight 722 dissolved into the chaos of deplaning. As the passengers streamed back into Gate K-12, they were met with a scene of quiet, controlled authority. Two uniformed FAA officials now stood beside a shell-shocked Brenda. Standing with them, his posture transformed, was the man in the faded gray hoodie. He was no longer slouched or anonymous. He stood tall, his gaze direct and commanding. Alistair watched as Captain Thorne, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror, was escorted by the station manager directly towards the group. Thorne's eyes met Alistair's. The disdain was gone, replaced by a desperate, pleading confusion. He saw the FAA badges. He saw the deference with which the other officials treated the man he had just humiliated. The pieces clicked into place with the sickening finality of a guillotine. Alistair stepped forward, his voice calm, and utterly devoid of emotion. He held up his official FAA credentials for Thorne to see clearly. The gold shield gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Captain Marcus Thorne." Alistair began, the sound of his voice cutting through the noise of the disgruntled passengers. "My name is Dr. Alistair Finch, Senior Field Investigator with the Federal Aviation Administration, pursuant to Title 14 of the Code of Federal Regulations. I am hereby informing you that you are the subject of a federal inquiry into violations of, among other statutes, 14 CFR Part 382, concerning the non-discrimination of passengers on the basis of appearance and perceived social status. Your aircraft is grounded, your crew is being detained for questioning, and your professional conduct is now the central focus of a full-scale license review. You were concerned about my meeting in DC, Captain. Well, congratulations. You've just become the main agenda." The conference room on the upper level of O'Hare's administrative wing was sterile and impersonal, a beige box designed for containing crises. It was now the impromptu headquarters of the FAA's investigation into Prestige Air Flight 722. The air hummed with a tension so thick it felt like a change in barometric pressure. Alistair Finch sat at the head of the long table, the faded gray hoodie now draped over the back of his chair. He was in his shirt sleeves, his demeanor all business. Across from him sat Anya Sharma's local liaison, a stern, no-nonsense woman named Peterson, and a legal counsel from the FAA's regional office. Their first interview was with Brenda, the gate agent. She entered the room looking like she had aged 10 years in the last hour. Her severe bob was disheveled, her makeup was smudged, and her hands trembled as she clutched a paper cup of water. All the brittle authority she had wielded at the gate had crumbled, leaving behind a terrified mid-level employee staring into the abyss of her career. "Ms. Schmidt," Alistair began, his voice unexpectedly gentle. He knew that bullies often folded under pressure, and aggression was less effective than letting them unravel on their own. "Let's be very clear about the situation. You are not the primary target of this investigation. However, your compliance with Captain Thorne's directive places you in a legally precarious position. Your best and only path forward is complete and total honesty." Brenda nodded, unable to speak. She took a shaky sip of water. "Tell me about Captain Thorne," Alistair continued. "Is it common for him to personally intervene in the boarding process?" Brenda found her voice a weak and reedy thing. "No, not usually. Only when he takes an interest in someone. He calls it vetting the cabin." "And what does vetting the cabin entail?" Peterson, the liaison, cut in her pen, poised over a notepad. "It means he stands there and watches the last few zones board. The economy passengers," Brenda stammered. "He believes you can tell a lot about people by how they dress, how they carry themselves. He has a profile he looks for." "A profile?" Alistair pressed. "Describe it." "People who don't fit the brand," Brenda admitted, her gaze fixed on the table. "He says Prestige Air is a premium carrier, not a flying Greyhound bus. He looks for people who look poor, disheveled. Sometimes he makes comments about their race, but mostly it's about class. He thinks looking poor is a sign of a disorderly life, and that makes them a risk." It was a stunning admission. This wasn't a one-off incident. It was a pattern of behavior, a personal policy of discrimination enacted under the guise of safety. Alistair and Peterson exchanged a significant look. This was bigger than one flight. "And has he ever denied boarding to anyone else based on this profile?" Alistair asked. Brenda hesitated, the fear of implicating herself warring with the fear of lying to a federal investigator. "A few times, maybe 3 or 4 in the past year that I've seen. We just log it as passenger non-compliant or security concern. The airline, they never question the captain's final word. The interview continued for another hour, with Brenda laying bare the ugly systemic prejudice that Thorne had fostered and that the airline through its negligence had allowed to fester. She was a woman who had followed a corrupt authority figure and was now desperately trying to save herself by exposing him. Next was Captain Marcus Thorne. He entered the room with a manufactured swagger, a pathetic attempt to reclaim the authority he had lost. His silver hair was perfectly combed, his tie retightened. He had tried to compose himself to build a wall of indignation around his fear. "I must protest this entire charade," Thorne began before he even sat down. "Grounding my aircraft, detaining my crew. This is a gross overreach of authority based on the complaint of one disgruntled individual who did not meet basic standards of presentation." Alistair let him talk, let him dig his own grave deeper. He didn't interrupt. He simply watched his dark eyes taking in every nuance of Thorne's blustering defense. "That disgruntled individual is the lead investigator of this panel, Captain," Peterson said dryly, gesturing to Alistair. Thorne's eyes flickered towards Alistair. "His position is irrelevant. It in fact makes this whole situation worse. He used his position to retaliate because his feelings were hurt. He should have identified himself." "And had I identified myself, you would have treated me differently," Alistair asked his first question, cutting through Thorne's tirade like a surgeon's scalpel. "Of course I would have shown a federal official the proper respect," Thorne blustered. "Exactly," Alistair said, leaning forward. "And therein lies the entire problem. FAA regulations, specifically 14 CFR Part 382, do not stipulate that a passenger must be a federal official to be treated with basic dignity and without discrimination. The rule applies to everyone, Captain. The person in the expensive suit in seat 2A and the person in the faded hoodie in seat 34B are entitled to the exact same protections. Your admission that you would have acted differently proves that you knew your initial actions were based on a discriminatory judgment of my appearance, not a legitimate safety concern." Thorne's face went from ruddy to pale. He had walked straight into a logical and legal trap. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had no answer. The door to the conference room opened, and a harried Robert Paulson, the station manager, scurried in. He was holding a phone, his hand covering the receiver. "Excuse me," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Mr. Harrison Vance for Dr. Finch. He's the chief operating officer of Prestige Air. He's on his way to O'Hare on a private jet." Alistair held out his hand for the phone. This was the escalation he had been expecting. The corporate cavalry was arriving not to fix the problem, but to manage the fallout, and most likely to try and intimidate him. "This is Finch," he said into the phone. The voice on the other end was smooth, polished, and oozing a corporate charm that felt predatory. "Dr. Finch Harrison Vance here. First, let me offer my most sincere, profound apologies for the absolutely unacceptable experience you had with our airline today. Captain Thorne's behavior was an aberration, a complete departure from the values of Prestige Air. I am personally flying to Chicago to make this right." "Mr. Vance," Alistair said, his voice cold as ice, "let me save you some jet fuel. This is no longer a customer service issue that can be smoothed over with apologies and travel vouchers. This is now a federal investigation into the operational culture and regulatory compliance of your airline. Your aberration just gave a sworn statement that this was in fact a regular practice for him, and that your airline never questions the captain's final word. So the question is no longer about one rogue pilot. It's about how deep the rot goes." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the phone. Vance, a man accustomed to solving problems with money and influence, was facing a wall he couldn't climb. What do you want?" Vance finally asked, the smooth charm gone, replaced by a raw, desperate edge. "What I want is irrelevant," Alistair replied. "What I am required to do by my mandate is to conduct a thorough and uncompromising investigation. Captain Thorne's pilot certificates are being suspended effective immediately pending a full revocation hearing. We are interviewing every member of the crew. One of them, a flight attendant named Isabella Rossi, has already requested to give a statement. She witnessed the entire event at the gate, and her initial report suggests she has much to say about Captain Thorne's conduct on other occasions as well. We are also impounding all complaint logs concerning Captain Thorne for the past 5 years. Your airline's operating license, Mr. Vance, is now under formal review." Alistair hung up the phone and placed it carefully on the table. He turned his attention back to the now ashen-faced Captain Thorne. "You said you were the king of your aircraft, Captain." Alistair set his voice a low, dangerous murmur. "You were wrong. The regulations are king. The law is king. And today, you flew your career directly into a mountain." Thorne slumped in his chair, the fight completely gone from him. The tailored uniform, once a symbol of his power and prestige, now looked like a costume on a broken man. He was no longer a king in his castle. He was just a man in a beige room, facing the ruin he had single-handedly created. The unraveling had just begun. The news of the grounding of Flight 722 and the subsequent federal investigation did not remain contained within the beige conference room at O'Hare. In the age of social media, secrets have a short lifespan. A passenger on the deplaned flight, the same businessman, who had been annoyed by the initial delay, had filmed Alistair's public confrontation with Captain Thorne on his phone. He hadn't understood the full context, but he knew drama when he saw it. He posted the 45-second clip to Twitter with the caption, "Crazy scene at ORD. Pilot refuses to let a guy on the plane, then feds show up and ground the flight. Prestige Air FAA grounded." The video was a spark in a digital tinderbox. It went from a few dozen views to thousands, then tens of thousands within hours. News outlets smelling blood picked it up. Aviation bloggers dissected it, frame by frame. The identities of Thorne and Alistair were not yet public, but the narrative was clear. A powerful airline captain had a spectacular fall from grace after a confrontation with a mysterious passenger. For Prestige Air, the ripple effect was a tsunami. By the time Harrison Vance's private Gulfstream G650 touched down at a private hangar at O'Hare, the company's stock was already in freefall. The video, combined with whispers of an FAA license review, had spooked investors. Millions of dollars in market capitalization had vanished in a single afternoon. Vance, a man whose entire world revolved around stock prices and shareholder value, stormed into the administrative wing with 2 corporate lawyers in tow. He was a vision of bespoke tailoring and simmering rage. He had come not to apologize, but to engage in damage control, which in his world meant a combination of threats, legal maneuvering, and overwhelming force. He found Alistair Peterson and their team in the same conference room, now poring over a mountain of printouts, the initial complaint files they had requisitioned from Prestige Air's headquarters. "Dr. Finch," Vance boomed, striding into the room as if he owned it. "This circus has gone on long enough. You've made your point. You've suspended my captain, you've terrified my employees, and you've cost my shareholders a fortune. What is the price to make this go away?" Alistair didn't even look up from the document he was reading. He simply held up a hand, signaling for Vance to wait. He finished the page, made a neat note in the margin, and then slowly raised his head, his eyes cool and impassive. "Mr. Vance, you seem to be operating under the misconception that this is a negotiation," Alistair said calmly. "There is no price. There is only the process, and the process is just beginning. He gestured to the piles of paper on the table. We've only just started reviewing the files on Captain Thorne, and what we're finding is illuminating. He picked up a sheet of paper. Here's a complaint from 8 months ago. A female passenger alleges Captain Thorne referred to her and her traveling companion as vacationing bimbos over an open cockpit mic he thought was turned off. The airline's official response: Captain was counseled. No further action. He picked up another sheet. Here's one from 2 years ago. A family of Indian descent filed a formal complaint stating that Captain Thorne repeatedly asked them if they were sure they were on the right flight, and made several comments about the smell of curry. The resolution: no evidence of wrongdoing found. He picked up a third. And this one is my personal favorite. A complaint from a junior flight attendant filed 3 years ago, alleging a pattern of verbal harassment and a hostile work environment created by Captain Thorne. This one is particularly interesting because the flight attendant, a Ms. Isabella Rossi, withdrew her complaint 1 week after filing it. I believe we have Ms. Rossi waiting to give her statement now. I imagine she might be more willing to speak freely this time, wouldn't you agree? Vance's face had gone rigid, the color draining from it with each complaint Alistair read. He knew about these complaints. He had personally signed off on burying them. Thorne was one of their most senior pilots, a star who flew high-value routes. It was easier to placate the occasional complainant and protect the asset than to address the underlying rot. Now that rot was being exposed to the full, unforgiving light of a federal inquiry. This is a witch hunt, one of Vance's lawyers muttered. No, Alistair corrected his voice like steel. This is what happens when the witches are actually real. Your airline didn't just tolerate a problematic pilot, Mr. Vance. It cultivated him. It protected him. It created a system where prejudice was mistaken for discretion, and customer complaints were treated as a nuisance. You didn't have a rogue pilot problem. You have a corporate culture problem, and the FAA takes a very dim view of that. The door opened, and Isabella Rossi was escorted in. The young flight attendant was nervous, but her eyes were filled with a steely resolve. She had witnessed the incident at the gate, and it had been the final straw. She saw Alistair and gave him a small, grateful nod. She was ready to talk, to finally tell the truth she had been pressured into silencing years earlier. Vance saw her and knew the game was up. Isabella's testimony combined with the documented history and Alistair's own personal experience was an avalanche of evidence. There would be no containing this. His strategy of intimidation had failed spectacularly. The investigation widened over the next few days. What started with one pilot became a deep dive into the airline's training protocols, its HR practices, and its entire complaint resolution system. FAA auditors descended on Prestige Air's corporate headquarters in Dallas, seizing servers and interviewing executives. The story was no longer just a viral video. It was a leading national news story about corporate malfeasance and systemic discrimination. The financial bleeding continued. Prestige Air was forced to cancel hundreds of flights as the FAA mandated immediate system-wide retraining for all pilots and gate staff on anti-discrimination law. The cost was astronomical. Business travelers, the airline's bread and butter, began booking with competitors unwilling to be associated with the tarnished brand. For Marcus Thorne, the fall was absolute. Stripped of his license and facing potential civil lawsuits from past victims who were now coming forward, he became a pariah. The exclusive country club he belonged to quietly revoked his membership. The friends who had once admired his swagger now crossed the street to avoid him. He was a man who had built his identity on a foundation of superiority, and that foundation had been dynamited. He was forced to sell his sprawling home to cover his legal fees, the very picture of the undesirable he had so despised. Harrison Vance was summoned to an emergency board meeting. The shareholders watching their investments evaporate wanted a sacrifice. They wanted the man who had overseen the negligence, who had prioritized protecting a toxic asset over the integrity of the company. Before they could fire him, he resigned. His golden parachute was rescinded due to the gross negligence clause in his contract. His career in aviation, and likely in any major corporate leadership role, was over. The ripple effect had spread far beyond Gate K-12. It had torn through the lives of the powerful and arrogant, a direct consequence of a single ugly act of prejudice. Alistair Finch, still in his simple, unassuming clothes, watched it all unfold, not with glee, but with a grim sense of necessity. The system was sick, and sometimes the only cure was radical surgery. 3 months after the grounding at O'Hare, the final act of the drama unfolded in a place far removed from the chaotic hustle of an airport. The setting was the main auditorium of the FAA headquarters in Washington, D.C., a room defined by polished mahogany American flags and the crushing weight of federal authority. The air was thick with a silence that felt more profound than mere quiet. It was the sound of careers and corporate futures hanging in the balance. The room was packed, a stark tableau of the opposing forces. On one side sat the new leadership of Prestige Air, a collection of grim-faced executives led by a crisis management CEO named Arthur Davenport, flanked by a team of high-priced lawyers from a prestigious D.C. firm. On the other side sat the FAA's legal team, headed by a sharp, formidable counsel named Jessica Morales. And with them, dressed in a simple but impeccably tailored dark suit, was Dr. Alistair Finch. He was no longer the ghost in the machine. He was its primary witness, the author of the damning 300-page report that sat in a thick binder before each of the 3 senior administrators on the judicial panel. Arthur Davenport, a man renowned for saving sinking corporate ships, spoke first. His voice, usually a tool of confident command, was laced with a desperate, pleading humility. He was a surgeon trying to convince the world a patient with a terminal diagnosis could still be saved. "Members of the panel," he began, his hands clasped on the lectern before him. "Let me state unequivocally, what happened to Dr. Finch was appalling. It was a failure on every level, and for that, Prestige Air is profoundly sorry. The individuals responsible, Mr. Vance Captain Thorne, have been removed. They were cancerous growths on an otherwise healthy body. We have already begun a complete overhaul from the boardroom to the baggage claim. New training, new oversight, a new passenger bill of rights. The 9,000 employees of Prestige Air mechanics, flight attendants, schedulers, and dedicated pilots who do their job with honor every single day. They are not the ones who committed these sins. We ask you not to punish the innocent for the unforgivable actions of a few. Allow us the chance to prove that the new Prestige Air can be a model of service and integrity. Allow us to save this airline and the livelihoods that depend on it." He spoke of contrition and a brighter future, but his plea felt hollow, a desperate script read under duress. When he finished, the panel gave him a series of curt, non-committal nods. Then Jessica Morales approached the lectern. She was the antithesis of Davenport. Where he was emotional, she was clinical. Where he pleaded, she prosecuted. Mr. Davenport speaks of cancerous growths as if they were random mutations. She began, her voice crisp and clear. But the evidence presented in our report shows that this was not a cancer that appeared overnight. It was a disease that the corporate body of Prestige Air actively fed and nurtured for years. This wasn't about a few bad apples. This was about an orchard that was deliberately cultivated to produce them. She proceeded to dismantle Prestige Air's defense piece by damning peace. The viral video of the incident at Gate K-12 was played on a large screen, Alistair's calm questioning and Thorne's sneering contempt filling the silent room. She read from internal emails seized during the investigation, where Harrison Vance instructed his HR department to handle the Thorne complaints with minimum fuss to avoid upsetting a pilot who delivers consistent on-time performance. She played audio from Isabella Rossi's deposition, her voice trembling but firm as she recounted Thorne's constant harassment and the meeting where a senior manager advised her that pursuing her complaint would be detrimental to her long-term career prospects. This was the culture, Morales stated, pausing to let the weight of Isabella's testimony sink in. A culture where on-time performance was valued more than human dignity. A culture where employees were taught that speaking up was a career-ending move. This wasn't a failure of one pilot. It was a failure of leadership, a failure of ethics, a failure of the fundamental duties required to hold an operating certificate. Finally, Alistair was called to the stand. He moved with a quiet confidence, his presence commanding the room's full attention. Morales led him through the events of that day, but his most powerful testimony came when he addressed the core principles at stake. An airline operating license is not a right. It is a privilege, he stated, his gaze sweeping across the panel. It is a covenant between the carrier and the public. A promise of safety, yes, but also a promise of fair and equal treatment under the law. Prestige. Air did not merely break that covenant, they systematically dismantled it. They created an environment where a pilot believed he had the right to act as a one-man class system at 30,000 feet, where the value of a passenger was judged by the quality of their clothes rather than the validity of their ticket. When Morales finished Prestige Air's lead counsel, a bulldog of a lawyer named Connolly rose for the cross-examination. His strategy was clear: to paint Alistair as a vindictive agent with a personal grudge. "Dr. Finch," Connolly began, his tone dripping with theatrical skepticism. "You are the FAA's top field investigator, are you not? A man trained to be objective. And yet wouldn't you agree that on that day you felt personally targeted, humiliated even?" Alistair met his gaze without blinking. "What I felt is irrelevant. The regulations are not designed to protect an investigator's feelings. They are designed to protect the public, a grandmother, a student, a construction worker from the exact conduct I documented. My experience was simply the litmus test that revealed the poison in the system." Connolly pressed on, sensing he'd lost that angle. "You admit you intentionally dressed in a manner that was, let's say, out of character for a senior government official. Was it not your intention to provoke a reaction?" "My intention," Alistair corrected, his voice dangerously soft, "was to experience the airline as any ordinary citizen might. My job is to audit the reality, not the performance a company puts on for a scheduled inspection. The question is not why I was dressed in a hoodie, but why a hoodie was seen by a pilot as a justification for public ridicule and the denial of a legal right. Captain Thorne didn't react to my clothes. He reacted to what he perceived those clothes to mean about my social and economic worth. Prestige Air's culture gave him the confidence to do so openly." Connolly had no reply. He had tried to attack the man, but the man had turned the attack back onto the indefensible actions of the company. He mumbled, "No further questions," and returned to his seat, defeated. The panel's deliberation was by Washington standards shockingly brief. They returned in under an hour, their faces grim set like stone. The presiding administrator, a woman with decades of service, adjusted her glasses and began to read from a prepared statement. The verdict was a thunderclap, a series of blows from which Prestige Air would not easily recover. First, the fine. Not a slap on the wrist, but a crushing financial penalty of $50 million, the largest ever levied by the FAA for discriminatory practices. A collective gasp came from the Prestige Air delegation. Second, probation. The airline would not have its license revoked, but would be placed on a zero-tolerance probationary period for 5 years, an unprecedented length of direct oversight. Any verified complaint of a similar nature would trigger an immediate revocation hearing. Third, a federally appointed independent compliance officer would be installed on the Prestige Air Board of Directors, with full access to all records and veto power over any decisions related to hiring, firing, and training protocols. "We are putting the FAA in your boardroom," the administrator said, looking directly at Davenport. Fourth, a $10 million portion of the fine was to be allocated to establish a compensation fund for any passengers who could demonstrate they had been victims of similar discriminatory practices by the airline over the past 7 years. Alistair's case had opened the door for all the others whose complaints had been ignored. The individual karma was just as absolute. Marcus Thorne's lifetime revocation was upheld. He was last seen by a former colleague working as a dispatcher for a small cargo airline in West Texas, tracking planes on a screen, a constant silent reminder of the sky he could no longer touch, a world he had lost through his own hubris. Harrison Vance, beyond his public disgrace, was now the subject of an SEC investigation for deliberately misleading shareholders about the company's internal health, his legal battles just beginning. Brenda Schmidt, having lost her job, found work at an insurance call center, spending her days speaking in the polite, scripted tones she had once disdained in others. Isabella Rossi, however, was celebrated. She was promoted to head Prestige Air's new Office of Employee and Customer Integrity, the very department created by the FAA's mandate. She became a powerful agent of change, ensuring the voice of the crew and the rights of the passengers would never be silenced again. And Dr. Alistair Finch. He was in the airport a few weeks later, heading for Seattle. He wore simple jeans and a plain blue polo shirt. He was just another face in the crowd, a quiet guardian watching, waiting, and ensuring that the promise of the skies was a promise kept for everyone. The system was flawed, but it was not broken, and he was there to hold it accountable. The reckoning was over, but his work was not. That right there is a story of how one man's quiet dignity in the face of blatant prejudice brought an entire corporate empire to its knees. It's a powerful reminder that the abuse of power, no matter how small it seems at the moment, can have catastrophic consequences. Captain Thorne thought he was just putting a poor man in his place, but he was actually signing the death warrant for his own career. This wasn't just about a dress code. It was about the fundamental right to be treated with respect. What do you think? Was the punishment fitting for the crime? Have you ever witnessed something like this happen? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you and you believe that karma always finds its address, please hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to see it, and make sure you subscribe to the channel for more true-life dramas where the powerful get their ultimate comeuppance. Thanks for listening.